Hello, good morning, friends. Today in this lecture, in this video lecture, we will discuss about the new classical or new classicism or new classical movement in English literature. Dear friends, the word neo has been derived from the Greek word neos. It means young or new, while the word classics refer to the style and works of the ancient author from Greece and Rome. It means that neoclassicism is the rebirth or restoration of the old classicism. Hence, neoclassicism is the movement in history of English literature which laid immense emphasis on the revival of the classical spirit during the period between 1680 to 1750 in the age of Pope and Dryden. Dear friend, it is a prototype of classicism. We find different names or stages of neoclassicism from the period 1680 to 1750. The neoclassical age is also called as the restoration period because the King Charles was restored in this era. Therefore, it is called as the restoration period. The period lasts from 1660 to 1700. Then the same age is also called as Augustan age because the writer of this period have tried to follow the footpath of the writers of the period of Augustus, the emperor, the great emperor of. During the particular period, many great writers from the Rome were produced, like Horace, Virgil. All the writers of the Augustan period, all the British writers particularly, they have tried to follow the footpaths of Horace and Virgil. That is why the age of Pope and Dryden is also called as the Augustan age. The age lasted from 1700 to 1750. Then the same age is also called as the age of Johnson. The age of Johnson lasted up to 1798, when the Romantic movement was underway with the publication of the lyrical ballad by William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge. Dear friends, now let us see the main characteristics of the neoclassical poetry. There are several characteristics of neoclassical poetry. Let us try to point out one by one. Okay. Number one, adherence to the classical rules and respect for rules. Dear friends, the neoclassical poets were the great adherents of the classical rules. They underwent all out to review the classicism in their poetry by following each and every rule of classicism. Their highest concern was to adhere to the classical rules and to follow and use them in their poetry as much as possible. That is why the neoclassical poetry is also called as pseudo-classical poetry. They respected the classical rules to a great extent. Let us look at the following example from the Pope's poetry. Those rules of old discovered, not devised. Alexander Pope, in one of his poems, says, those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodicized. Dear friends, the second important characteristics of neoclassicism is intellectual quality and scholarly allusions. The neoclassical poetry and neoclassical poets always loved to make use of scholarly allusion in their poetry. They were all highly educated and well versed in various fields of studies. They knew a lot of religious, biblical, classical literature. Allusions helped them to convey their message to their readers effectively and easily. That is why their poetry is brimming with or full of many allusions to classical writers, that is, Virgil, Horace, and Homer. They desired to write in the manner of their classical masters. The third important characteristics is rationalism. Rationalism is the most essential feature of neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets viewed reason as the mainspring of learning, knowledge, and inspiration for their poetry. Neoclassical poetry is a reaction against the Renaissance style of poetry. It is a unique outcome of intellect, not fancy and imagination. Unlike the Romantic poetry, neoclassical poetry is stimulated, fabricated, stereotypical type of poetry. In Romantic poetry, sentiments plays vital role in the writing of poetry. While in neoclassical poetry, reason, intellect are the dominant variants or dominant elements. The neoclassical poets disregarded imagination, emotion, feelings while composing the poems. That is why their poetry may be branded as artificial and synthetic. Then the fourth point is didacticism. The neoclassical poets rebelled against the romantic nature of poetry of the Renaissance period. Romantic poets loved to compose poetry freely and just for the sake of poetry itself. Their foremost purpose was to give vent to their feelings. But on the other hand, the neoclassical poets laid stress significantly on the didactic purpose of the poetry. They tried hard to teach the humanity through the magical power of their poetry. That is why most of the neoclassical poetry is full with didacticism to a great deal. The fifth important point is realism and true picture of society. Realism is the hallmark of neoclassical poetry. Unlike the Romantic poets, the neoclassical poets were not living in their own imagination. They were hard realists and they presented the true picture of their society. They did not turn their eyes or close their eyes from the harsh reality of the life. They were keen observer and dwelled upon what they experienced with their open eyes in their poetry. They never tried to escape from or run away from the harsh realities of life with the help of imagination. Neoclassical poets were the men of action, and practically they lived in the amidst of people. That is why they had a very keen observation of their society. They avoid abstract ideas, imaginative thoughts, and even idealism in their poetry. Dryden's and Pope's poetry are full with of such examples of realism. Then we have the next point, that is easy, clear, and common subjects. Dear friend, the neoclassical poetry is easy, clear, and is like a common man is speaking to other common man. The work of the neoclassicist was praised by everyone at every place. Their purpose was not expressing their inner self, but to argue logically, but to convince with the help of logic. And the neoclassical poets wrote poems on public occasions. For example, the festivals or coronations or the national victory, etc. Then the next important characteristics of the poetry is heroic couplets. Dear friend, heroic couplet is another hallmark of neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets were the champion of the heroic couplets. No poet can compete with the mastery in handling the heroic couplets in the history of English literature except the neoclassical poets. They were excelled in this regard. Chaucer was the first poet who used it in his poems. Though several poets tried on heroic couplets, but Dryden and Pope are the only poets who remained the best one. They are considered as real master of heroic couplets. They polished heroic couplets, they corrected it, made it regular, made it flexible, and polished medium of poetic experience. It is said that Dryden wrote almost 30,000 heroic couplets. Now, what is heroic couplet? Heroic couplet is the two iambic pentameters lines rhyming together are called as heroic couplets. Then the next important point is no passionate lyricism, lack of emotions and imaginations in lyrics. Dear friend, romantic poetry is popular for lyrical quality, while the neoclassical poetry is lacking the romantic lyrical quality due to their apathy, due to their distance from the passion, feelings, and emotions. They looked at the passion with distrust and suspicion. That is why very few lyrics were written down in this age. They did not give free play to their imagination. Rather, they dwelt upon the intellectual aspects of poetry. We find intellect, wit, rather than the passion in their poetry. The neoclassical poets showed their art. They loved to use such artistic skills like pun, anagram, puzzles, and so on. The next important point in the characteristics of neoclassicism is objectivity. Objectivity is another important feature of neoclassical poetry. These poets were completely against the subjective poetry. Therefore, they had tried to write objective poetry. They avoid giving expression of their own. They avoided giving their own expression and their own feelings. Rather, they dwelt upon the miseries, the hardship, the problem of the common people who are around them. The next and the last important point in the characterization or characteristics of neoclassicism is poetic diction. Poetic diction of the neoclassical poetry is completely different from that of the romantic poetry. In romantic poetry, the diction is flexible, is very easy to use, while in the neoclassical poetry, it remained restrained, concrete, and rigid, fixed. The neoclassical poets were fond of using different language of poetry. They thought that there should be a dividing line. There should be a separate line, dividing line between the prose, language of the prose, and the language of the poetry. That is why they laid emphasis on the specific style for poetry. They were of view that decorum, specific style, mannerism are the vital elements of poetry. Dear friends, therefore we can say that neoclassical poetry was actually a reaction against the vanities of the metaphysics poet, and there were also the factors involved in it, such as the study of the classic, their admiration for the old classical writers, then the influence of the French writers on them, the intellectual approach, etc. All these things. In fact, neoclassical poetry did not contain the true spirit of the classicism. It also did not follow the original classical rules. Much attention is given to the form rather than to the substance or matter. Hence, the age is rightly called or named as the neoclassical rather than the classical. Okay, thank you. So this is my views regarding to neoclassical movement in English literature. I hope you understand it, and dear friends, please keep watching my videos on YouTube. Please subscribe my channels. Here you find in the box you find to me. You can easily contact to me. Thank you. Thanks a lot.